The sun sagged low over the ridges, spilling a molten glow across the western horizon, as if the desert itself bled out the last of the day. Red Mesa was a town built of weathered wood and shadows, the kind where folks kept their heads down and their voices hushed, because everyone knew the kind of men who ruled from the saddle. The Hollow Creek gang had ridden through more than once, leaving boot prints in the dust and fear in every heart. At dusk, the saloon doors creaked in rhythm with the warm, sour breath of whiskey inside, and the piano man had long stopped playing. He knew the gang's laughter carried further than his music ever could. Caleb Mercer leaned against a fence rail near the livery stable, a broad-shouldered man whose quiet nature had earned him a reputation for being forgettable. His hands, scarred from years of rope burns and branding irons, were steady on the wood, but his gaze kept straying down the main street. Luke, his younger brother, was inside the saloon, too bold, too full of words. Caleb had told him once that words could get a man shot faster than a bullet, but Luke believed in a world where justice could still be spoken aloud. Caleb had forgotten what that kind of hope felt like. The saloon's doors burst open with a slap of leather against wood. Laughter rolled out, sharp as broken glass, followed by Luke's voice, clear and stubborn. Caleb straightened. His brother strode into the street, boots kicking up dust, face flushed with that dangerous mixture of youth and conviction. Behind him, Mason Crow and 3 of his riders stepped into the fading light. Mason was a man with coal-black eyes and a smile that never touched them. The Hollow Creek gang didn't need a reason to kill, only an excuse, and Luke had just given them one. "Red Mesa don't belong to you," Luke said, his voice strong though it trembled at the edges. "You won't take another acre from these folks." The town seemed to hold its breath. Curtains twitched in windows. The smithy's hammer stopped mid-swing. Caleb's heart pounded against his ribs like a caged stallion. He wanted to run to his brother, to drag him out of harm's way, but something heavier than chains held him back. Pride, perhaps, or the terrible understanding that Luke had already crossed a line. Mason chuckled low, like gravel rattling in a tin pan. "Boy," he drawled, resting one hand on the ivory grip of his revolver, "you think words will stop men who ain't got no soul left to lose?" Luke's jaw set. Somebody's got to stand. The words seemed to echo down the silent street, bouncing off the clapboard walls and the dry gulch air. Caleb's breath caught as Mason's hand moved quicker than a snake's strike. The crack of the pistol split the twilight, and Luke staggered, a crimson bloom spreading across his shirt. For a moment his body swayed, stubborn against the weight of death, before crumpling to the dust. Caleb's legs moved before his mind did. He dropped to his knees in the dirt, gathering his brother's body against his chest. Luke's eyes fluttered, lips parting as if he wanted to say one last thing, but only a thin breath escaped. Caleb pressed his forehead to Luke's, whispering words he couldn't later remember. Around them, the town turned away. Men who once tipped their hats to Luke found something fascinating in their boots. Women shut their shutters tight. No one dared defy the Hollow Creek gang, not for a boy's life, not even for mercy. Mason holstered his revolver, spit into the dust, and turned with the lazy arrogance of a man who knew no law would follow. "Another lesson," he said, his voice carrying in the stillness. "Don't mistake courage for sense." The hoofbeats of the departing gang thundered against Caleb's grief, fading into the desert like a curse carried by wind. He stayed there long after, clutching Luke until the stars burned cold and bright overhead. His brother's body felt heavy, heavier than the world itself, and in the stillness, Caleb felt something inside him fracture, not in the way of breaking, but in the way of forging. The next morning, the church bell tolled for Luke Mercer, though no preacher dared say words over his grave. Caleb dug the earth himself, blistering his palms on the shovel, his jaw locked against tears. When the cross was raised and the last handful of dirt pressed down, he stood like a man carved from stone, silent and unreadable. The townsfolk gathered at a distance, shame clinging to them like dust, but not one dared approach. Caleb's eyes, once soft, seemed to look through people now, as if searching for something far beyond them. That night, a dust storm rolled in from the west. Wind howled through Red Mesa, rattling the shutters, carrying with it a wailing that sounded too much like grief-made voice. Coyotes barked and yipped on the ridges, their cries rising and falling in mournful chorus. Caleb sat alone by the fire in the ranch cabin, Luke's old hat in his hands. His brother's laughter lingered in the walls, ghostly echoes of a life too brief. Caleb placed the hat on the table, stared at it until the fire burned to coals, then stood and walked into the storm. Days passed. Caleb did not return. Some said he wandered into the canyons, where only rattlesnakes and shadows lived. Others whispered he went to the old war veterans, camped north of the river, men who carried their rifles like bones of old ghosts. Whatever the truth, Red Mesa saw no sign of him. Only the coyotes seemed to follow his trail, their cries unsettling the night. In town, life resumed under the shadow of the gang. Mason Crow rode back now and then, demanding coin, stock, and silence. No one resisted. No one mentioned Luke's name. But when folks gathered at the saloon and whispered low, their voices carried a tremor. They spoke of Caleb Mercer, the quiet ranch hand who had vanished into the desert with grief carved into his soul. Some said they'd seen him at dusk, a lone figure on the ridge, watching with eyes like iron. Others swore they heard shots echoing in the canyons, too fast and too clean to be practice. The truth, though hidden in dust and night, was simple. Caleb was not gone. He was changing. Grief had forged him in silence. Anger had sharpened him, and love for his brother had given him a purpose the law had failed to carry. Somewhere beneath the endless stars, a man once known for his quiet hands was learning to move faster than death itself. And though the town did not know it yet, the Hollow Creek gang had carved its own fate the moment Mason Crow spilled Luke's blood in the dirt. For legends are not born from peace. They rise from dust, from loss, and from the silence after a gunshot that should never have been fired. And as the desert wind carried Caleb Mercer further from the man he once was, Red Mesa braced for the day the quiet ranch hand would return, no longer a man, but something sharper, deadlier, and inevitable. The desert swallowed Caleb whole. Days turned into weeks as he wandered the canyons, their towering walls stained red, like old blood under the setting sun. He carried little but his brother's hat, a canteen, and the revolver Luke had never learned to draw fast enough. The grief did not ease. It hardened, like iron in a forge, tempered by silence and sand. Alone in the gulches, Caleb began to work. He faced boulders as if they were men, practiced the draw until his wrist ached and his fingers bled, and when the pistol's crack rolled through the stone corridors, it sounded like vengeance taking shape. At first, he was clumsy. His bullets dug more into the dirt than the rock he aimed for. But Caleb did not curse. He did not falter. Each failure became another nail in the coffin of the man he used to be. The more he missed, the more determined he grew. He rose before dawn, when the desert sky blushed with pale fire, and stayed until the stars burned cold. His shadow stretched long against the canyon walls, endlessly repeating the motion. Hand to holster, iron out, hammer back, trigger squeezed. Again, again, again. Old drifters sometimes crossed his path, men too broken to stay in towns, veterans of a war most folks wanted to forget. They watched him with wary eyes, recognizing something familiar in the way he carried his silence. One of them, a grizzled soldier with one arm missing and the scars of powder burns on his face, sat with Caleb by the fire one night. "It ain't just the hand," the man rasped, his voice like gravel stirred in whiskey. "It's the patience, the stillness before the storm. A man wins not when he's faster, but when he's calmest." He demonstrated with his remaining hand, a slow, deliberate motion of reaching, drawing, aiming. Caleb studied it like scripture. Another wanderer, a sharp-eyed drifter with skin darkened by years under the sun, taught him about angles and distance. "You don't just shoot at a man," the stranger said, tossing a tin can into the air. Caleb hit it once, then missed 3 times, before the drifter explained. "You shoot where he'll be, not where he stands. Time's always a fraction ahead of you. Learn to fire into tomorrow." Caleb did not argue. He just listened, absorbed, repeated. By the end of that week, the can did not touch the ground unscarred. Soon, whispers began drifting back into Red Mesa. Stories told over whiskey and in hushed tones beneath lantern light. Someone said Caleb split a rattlesnake's skull clean in half at 50 paces, its body still coiling when the dust settled. Another swore he saw Caleb hit a hawk in flight, though the bird lived, his bullets shearing only a single feather from its wing. Still others spoke of hearing shots echo through the canyons, too fast, too sharp, like lightning chained to a man's will. No one saw him much, but they felt his presence in the wind. The ranch hand was no longer invisible. He was becoming myth. Yet even as his hand grew steady, his heart remained a battlefield. Nights by the fire were haunted by Luke's voice, gentle and steady, preaching patience, mercy, the belief that a man ought never let hate guide his hand. Caleb remembered his brother's laughter, the way he saw good in everyone, even men like Mason Crow. If you kill a wolf, Luke had once said, you don't end the hunger. Another wolf comes. Those words dug deep, clashing with the memory of Luke's body bleeding in the dirt. Forgiveness was what Luke would have wanted, but justice was what Caleb could no longer resist. Sometimes Caleb would lower the revolver, trembling in the half-light, torn between burying it in the sand forever or sharpening it into a sword of retribution. His prayers, when he muttered them, went unanswered. The desert gave him only silence, broken by the cry of coyotes and the whisper of dry wind. In that emptiness, his brother's ghost seemed to hover, neither guiding him nor condemning him, just watching. Caleb came to understand that forgiveness and vengeance were not opposites. They were weights on the same scale, and he had to choose which would balance his soul. When at last he returned to the edge of town, it was not to seek comfort, but to confront doubt. Sheriff Briggs found him first. The sheriff was a weary man, gray threaded through his beard, his badge polished less from pride than from habit. He saw Caleb leaning against the post near the smithy, revolver low on his hip, eyes like cooled iron. Briggs stepped close, his boots grinding softly in the dust. "Caleb," he said, voice cautious, "I've been hearing the talk. Folks say you're fixin' to take on the Hollow Creek boys. Let me give you plain truth. The law don't run them out. They run the law. I can't stop them, and neither can you. Best you bury your grief with your brother and let the world keep turning." Caleb's gaze didn't move. "If the law won't stop them," he said softly, "then what good is the law?" Briggs's jaw tightened. "You think vengeance will ease your pain. You'll bring more blood, more widows, more graves. Luke wouldn't want this." The mention of his brother's name cut like glass, but Caleb only straightened. "Luke's dead because no one stood. I won't make the same mistake." The sheriff shook his head, heavy with sorrow, and walked away. The town watched from corners and windows, their fear etched deeper than ever. They admired Caleb's steel, but none dared join it. They were chained by terror, and he was breaking free of it. That difference made him both dangerous and necessary. The days that followed were painted in fire and steel. At sunset, Caleb stood alone against the canyon horizon, the dying light staining the revolver in his hand. He drew until the metal scalded his palm, fired until the barrel smoked, reloaded by instinct, and began again. Sometimes his fingers bled, raw from the ceaseless grind, but he wrapped them in cloth and continued. His movements grew smoother, faster, until they no longer seemed human but something elemental, like the desert wind itself had taken form in his draw. At night, the firelight flickered against the revolver, casting long shadows on the canyon walls. Caleb's silhouette danced there, tall and unyielding, moving through the ritual of a man becoming something more than mortal. He was crafting himself into a weapon, not out of hunger for glory, but out of love for the brother who had fallen, and rage for the injustice that had followed. The coyotes still cried from the ridges, their calls eerie and endless. But now, when they howled, it seemed less like mourning and more like a herald. For the desert was forging a legend in its quiet, patient way, and Caleb Mercer was learning to live in that silence, waiting for the moment when silence would end in thunder. The summer heat clung to Red Mesa like a fever, baking the earth until it cracked beneath boots and hooves. The townsfolk moved slower in those days, wary of the dust, wary of the silence that stretched too long between the clang of the blacksmith's hammer and the ring of the church bell. Months had passed since Luke Mercer had been gunned down in the street, but the wound lingered, raw and festering in the hearts of those who had watched and done nothing. They prayed, quietly and desperately, that the Hollow Creek gang had taken their fill and would never return. But prayers carried no weight against men who knew only hunger and greed. The sound came first, a distant thunder of hooves, rolling over the mesa and sinking into the town's bones. Mothers snatched children off the street. Merchants slammed shutters and barred doors, the metallic clangs echoing like funeral tolls. The piano in the saloon went silent mid-note, and even the barkeep set down his glass with trembling hands. No one had to look to know who was coming. The Hollow Creek gang rode like a storm you could see from miles away, black dust swirling in their wake. Mason Crow led them, tall in the saddle, coattails whipping against his horse's flank. His eyes, dark and bottomless, surveyed the town with the calm of a man who already owned it. Behind him trailed a half-dozen killers, each one swaggering, each one grinning like wolves who'd scented blood. They rode straight through the main street, reins loose, guns resting easy on their hips. Mason reined up outside the saloon, his voice carrying like a preacher's sermon. "Red Mesa," he called, his grin cold. "Seems you've forgotten who holds your reins. Time we reminded you." One of his men dismounted and kicked over a barrel of apples at the grocer's stand, sending fruit tumbling into the dust. Another yanked a farmer by the collar, demanding coin he didn't have. Laughter rose, harsh and jagged, as though Luke's blood had never stained this same street. And then Mason spoke his name. "Luke Mercer," he drawled, mocking and careless. "Boy thought he was a man, didn't he? Funny thing, how easy he dropped." A hush fell deeper than before. The name was rarely spoken now, too heavy with shame, too raw with guilt. Faces turned away, some closed eyes tight, praying the words would vanish. But they didn't vanish. They burned in the air like brands. That was when a figure stepped from the edge of the alley, moving with the slow certainty of a man who had no need to rush. The brim of a weathered hat shaded his face, but the line of his shoulders, the calm weight of his stride, was unmistakable. Caleb Mercer walked into the street with the sun at his back, wearing Luke's old hat, its crown dented and brim sweat-stained. Dust clung to his boots, but his revolver rode clean and low at his side. Every head turned. Whispers hissed through the air, barely louder than the shuffle of boots against dirt. The gang shifted in their saddles, eyes narrowing. Mason alone grinned wider, like a man handed a gift he hadn't asked for but would gladly take. "Well, if it ain't the ranch hand," Mason said, his voice dripping contempt. "Come to beg for scraps, Caleb? Or did you figure you'd follow your brother into the ground?" Caleb stopped 10 paces away. The street stretched wide between them, silence folding over every word. He lifted his head, his eyes dark steel under the brim. "You mocked him when you killed him," he said, voice low, steady as a drumbeat. "You mock him still, but you won't speak his name again." The words weren't shouted, yet they carried, threading through every shuttered window, every trembling heart. For the first time since Luke's death, the town felt breath stir in its chest. Mason laughed, sharp and cruel. "Boy, you've been playing outlaw in the desert, haven't you? Heard the stories. Caleb Mercer, faster than a rattler's strike. But stories ain't bullets. You're still just a ranch hand with a dead brother." The men around him chuckled, but their hands twitched, restless, creeping closer to the grips of their pistols. The tension wrapped around the street like a noose, tightening with each passing breath. Caleb didn't move. His stance was calm, loose, the way a shadow rests against the ground. His hand hovered near his revolver, but there was no tremor, no rush. His stillness unsettled them more than any threat could have. "Ranch hand, maybe," he said, the words cutting clean through the heavy air. "But I've buried more than cattle, and I've spent every hour since my brother's blood hit this dirt preparing for this moment." A gust of wind stirred, sweeping dust across the street. The church bell creaked on its beam. Somewhere, a dog barked once and fell silent. The world seemed to pause, holding itself taut for what everyone knew was about to come. Mason's eyes narrowed. His grin faltered, replaced by a sharper edge. He leaned forward in his saddle, hand brushing the ivory grip of his revolver. "Then show me, Mercer," he said. "Show me how a boy becomes a killer." The street tightened, breathless. Caleb's eyes locked on Mason's, and for a long moment, time itself seemed to halt. No one moved. Every sound dulled except the whisper of leather, the scrape of boots in the dust, the faint creak of reins. Fingers hovered over triggers. Hearts pounded like war drums. It was the kind of silence that only ended one way, with thunder. The wind died as if the desert itself held its breath. Dust spun in lazy spirals across the street, catching the low sun in a haze of gold. Mason Crow's hand twitched, fast as lightning, ivory-handled revolver flashing from his holster. But Caleb was already moving, faster than thought, faster than memory. His gun cleared leather in a blur, muzzle sparking once, sharp final. Mason's shot never came. His revolver sagged useless as the bullet struck his chest, the grin on his lips freezing before his body toppled from the saddle. He hit the ground with a hollow thud, eyes wide, already gone. For one heartbeat, silence ruled. Then chaos broke. The Hollow Creek gang howled like wolves denied their alpha. Guns jerked free, steel glinting in every hand. Caleb stepped forward into the storm, calm as stone, each motion fluid, unhurried, inevitable. His revolver spat fire and smoke, the rhythm of his shot steady, merciless. One outlaw fell against a trough, water spilling red. Another spun backward through a saloon window, glass exploding into the street. A third never cleared his weapon. Caleb's bullet found him before he could breathe. He whispered his brother's name with each trigger pull, soft, reverent, like a prayer said over every shot. Luke. The crack. Another man down. Luke. The echoes shivered against the canyon wind. The name steadied his hand, sharpened his aim, and filled the space between rage and sorrow. He wasn't killing for bloodlust. He was carving justice into the earth with every round. The gang fired wildly, bullets splintering posts, shattering windows, whistling past terrified townsfolk who crouched behind doors and barrels. But Caleb never flinched. He shifted with uncanny precision, stepping aside at the right second, leaning just enough to let a bullet hiss past his shoulder, answering each shot with a cleaner one. Smoke rolled around him, and through it he looked less like a man and more like a figure born of legend, eyes glowing pale beneath the brim of his brother's hat. One outlaw rushed him with a knife, screaming for courage. Caleb's revolver clicked empty. Without hesitation, he swung the weapon by its barrel, cracking the steel hard across the man's skull. The outlaw dropped, and in the same breath Caleb slid another cartridge in, spun the chamber, and raised it to fell another who thought the opening would save him. The precision was terrifying, almost unnatural. And then the truth slipped from whispered lips in the crowd. Sharpshooter. Someone breathed, eyes wide as if recalling a ghost. That's Caleb Mercer. He fought in the war. The Deadeye of Shiloh. The name spread like fire. Men remembered tales of a young soldier whose rifle could split a coin at 100 yards, whose pistol cleared whole trenches when ambushed. Caleb had buried that life deep, hidden it beneath cattle work and silence, but the war never left him. It had only been waiting, sealed behind grief until Luke's blood unlocked it. The outlaws faltered. For every one of them who fell, the others saw their own fate mirrored in Caleb's unblinking stare. Mason's bravado had carried them for years, but without him, their courage crumbled. They broke formation, panic cracking their unity, and Caleb cut through them like a desert wind stripping flesh from bone. When the last shot rang, it hung in the air like a tolling bell. A body slumped into the dust. Smoke drifted, curling skyward, carrying with it the acrid scent of powder and the final groans of dying men. The street was littered with them, once feared, now fallen, their shadows already claimed by the setting sun. Caleb stood in the center, chest rising and falling with steady breaths. His revolver dangled loosely in his grip, barrel still smoking. He looked down at Mason Crow, sprawled lifeless in the dirt, and whispered one last time, "For Luke." Then he holstered the weapon with a motion as deliberate as every shot that had come before. The townsfolk emerged slowly, as if waking from a long nightmare. Faces pale, hands trembling, they stared at Caleb as though he were something not wholly human. Awe, fear, relief, all tangled in their eyes. No one cheered. No one dared. They simply watched, humbled by what they had witnessed. The Hollow Creek gang, who had ruled them through terror, lay scattered like broken idols. and the man who felled them walked among their corpses, without a flicker of triumph. Only the heavy weight of justice carried out. Caleb did not stop in town. He walked the long road back to his brother's ranch, boots scuffing softly in the dust, the wide silence stretching behind him like a cloak. The sun dipped low, setting the sky on fire, its light bathing the land in crimson. He reached the small grave by the fence line, where a wooden cross stood plain and weathered. Luke's name was carved into it, simple letters dug by Caleb's own hand. He removed the hat from his head, the old, sweat-stained crown his brother once wore with pride, and placed it gently on the cross. His hand lingered there, fingers brushing the wood as though touching Luke one final time. His eyes closed, and for the first time since that bloody dusk months ago, he let out a breath that trembled. Behind him, the town would speak his name in hushed voices. They would tell their children of the night Caleb Mercer faced down the Hollow Creek gang and walked away, not as a ranch hand, not even as a soldier, but as something greater, a legend forged from silence, sorrow, and justice. And when the story spread across the frontier, it would carry with it a closing truth spoken like gospel. Nobody warned the bandits, because legends need no warning.